if we are working on that foundation of really solid relationships, and we know that if we do that, we're going to have more candor and more alignment and all the things that matter. The thing that's also going to happen is we're likely to have more trust. And sometimes, especially in the climate we're in today, I think you and I are seeing more and more teams are having trust issues. It bubbles up every time we do gap interviews, every time that we do our investigative work to get ready for a large project. We always find that word bubbles to the surface. So I think those other things we mentioned, all important, but it's also the lack of relationships and the lack of candor. All those things are creating environments where distrust is prominent.
Well, I'm excited about this week's show. This week's show is with my good friend and co-founder and business partner, Randy Hain. He's also the president of Servium Partners. And Randy and I have co-founded the Leadership Foundry. The website's actually myleadershipfoundry.com. And it, of course, sponsors the Workplace Therapist Show. And today we are going to talk about specifically what we see when teams are dysfunctional, particularly senior teams, and ways to make them more functional and ultimately high performing. So whether you're sitting on a senior team or you're watching a senior team or even thinking about your own team, we're going to provide some great tips and tricks on how to do that. So I love any opportunity I get to interview Randy because he's just full of all this great insights and knowledge. So listen real close to not only Randy's list of issues, but also some of the practical steps that he provides to help us get a little bit more healthy in how we function as a team.
The Workplace Therapist Show is sponsored by the Leadership Foundry. Bringing a cutting-edge, real-world approach to leadership development, the Leadership Foundry partners with each client organization to create a custom-tailored experience, virtual or in person, that combines innovative leadership content, world-class facilitators, and one-on-one coaching to ensure your leaders have everything they need to grow and thrive. To find out more and to design your one-of-a-kind program, visit myleadershipfoundry.com.
Well, Randy, I'm really excited about our conversation today, as I'm excited about all of our conversations we have. And so for those who have not gotten a chance to hear you on prior shows, not only are you president of Servium Partners, but you and I are both co-founders of Leadership Foundry, which sponsors this podcast. And at Leadership Foundry, a lot of what we do is we're either working with teams, leadership cohorts of groups of leaders inside companies or organizations and growing them, but we also work with leadership teams. And so I say that to say our conversation today is going to be me picking your brain and us sharing some thoughts on what makes really high-performing senior teams. So when senior teams are really firing on all cylinders and those relationships are really strong, what does that look like? But also on the other side, like when there's things that aren't going so well, what are some of those issues?
One of my favorite topics.
I know. I thought this would be a good topic. So maybe a good starting place. Let's start with broken stuff first.
Okay.
What are some of the things when you think of senior teams, and you walk into a room, or in this case, we do a Zoom session, and immediately your radar goes off. What makes you kind of worried? What are some signals to you that things are maybe not quite as good as they should be?
I find when the team is not able to really have open and honest conversations, my radar goes up that candor could be an issue on this team. You sense the vibe. There's very polite surface conversation, or maybe people aren't saying anything at all. And certainly when you get into the agenda of a meeting, you just find that they're just not really opening up and saying what needs to be said. So I think the lack of candor is something that I pick up on very quickly. And it's one of my favorite topics, but that's a big one.
So I want to dig in a little bit more on that one. I know you've got more, but when you think about candor, is it candor about issues going on in the business? Or is it candor about maybe something that you've done that's irritated me? Is it like the people dynamic, or is it business issue dynamic, or another one, or both?
I think it's both, because and there are a myriad of reasons why I think people are not candid, but I think there's just this, you and I joke that a lot of companies may have after their name the word nice, like it's ABC company nice, or whatever nice. And sometimes within a company, there's just this sort of expectation that we're not going to have the real conversations. We're not going to go there. We don't want to cause anyone to feel uncomfortable. We don't want to cause embarrassment. We don't want to put ourselves at risk by saying the difficult thing. And it's really sad and tragic because the lack of candor creates ineffectiveness and inefficiency on a pretty big scale. And you and I see it in a lot of the companies that we've encountered over the years. So I think it's both. I think it's on a personal level, but also certainly talking about real issues in the company.
Yeah, so you came right out of the gate and hit us with a really important one and big one, candor. Any other things that you see when they kind of make your back of your hair stand up a little bit?
This has been something that I really think has been significantly negatively impacted by COVID. I think relationships are deteriorating on executive teams, senior teams. And I can just pick up on the vibe. Now, you and I do so much of our work via Zoom, so we're watching the players, we're listening to them. But when we do our deep dive work and do our executive coaching work, whatever else we're doing behind the scenes, we often find that these teams are not really talking to each other. They're not really investing in each other. They're not really spending time getting to know what's going on in each other's lives. Now, as you and I would both agree, pre-COVID, you drop by someone's office. Let's go grab lunch in the cafeteria. Let's get a beer after work. And it was easy. But I think people have failed to operationalize a lot of those activities that they used to take for granted. And what I see is a direct impact on teams when it comes to relationships. So because they're not investing the way they used to, you just see this slow deterioration happening. And I think the impact on relationships is significant. And I would tell you personally, in all the teams that I've seen us work with, I think it's an issue.
Yeah. So is that something that can be fixed virtually? Because a lot of companies, you and I were talking about one specific one that we said, oh gosh, they just announced they're not coming back until January 2022. I can't even, that doesn't even roll off my tongue well. I can't even believe we're talking 2022, but they're not even coming back in person until then. So can you build or nurture those relationships virtually?
Absolutely. I think the first thing is within any good diagnosis is, do we have a problem? Are we self-aware that we have an issue? So once you identify that relationships is an issue, you have to be very intentional and you have to make a commitment. So I think that teams that can turn this around, and I've seen teams turn it around. Sometimes you and I guide them to do this, but they have to learn how to connect differently. Be intentional about calling your colleagues each week and don't have a purely business agenda. Ask how they're doing at home. Be vulnerable and talk about how you're doing. And that's a big one.
Yeah.
I think, I'm going to have lunch tomorrow. Why don't you get on and we'll just have lunch together and catch up and talk. We all want to be safe, but I think we can also be safe and be together. I've had clients near me. We both live up in the Roswell area, but I've seen some clients that have gathered over at Sweet Apple Elementary to walk around the trail, and they do it together with masks on, but they're taking walks together. I love that idea. Go to a restaurant patio and sit outside, mask up and be safe, but there are ways that we can get together safely. But if nothing else, pick up the phone and call and don't make it all about business. So with intention and a commitment and a little annoyance, it can be a little frustrating, we can make this happen. But I think over the last year, I think people have lost sight of that and they've not made that commitment.
Yeah, so we've got candor, big issue. Relationships are deteriorating and maybe not being invested in the way they should be. So I can almost imagine the bank account probably wasn't high enough before anyway, and now it's really getting impacted. Any other big signs for you when you're thinking about teams?
I wrote about this several weeks ago in a blog post, and the post was called Creating Space. And I wrote about what I think is this significant challenge that really all leaders are facing right now, where maybe working from home, they just feel like they've got to fill up that old commute time or time that they used to spend traveling or being in an office. It's a different vibe and feel. When they're in their home offices, they just seem to be locked into Zoom meetings or Teams calls all day long without a break. They're just going from call to call, from virtual meeting to virtual meeting. And I think that this focus on just working through the day without any break is really affecting leaders and teams. So what I advocated in that blog post is you need to create space. Have a gap between meetings. Take a few minutes just to reflect on the next call. Think about the meeting that you're about to get into. Think about who's in the meeting. Think about what's going on in their lives. Think about how you can achieve a win-win and not just get something off your plate, but actually think about how you can get something done with your teammates. So that may seem like a very minor thing, but I think it's actually a big deal that leaders and teams are not creating space to be thoughtful about one another. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah. You know, you and I often talk about kind of that concept, which is not our concept, but one that very much applies in leadership, is going from working in the business to on the business, right? Creating space to do that. So you're not just constantly running. You're pausing for a minute, thinking about others, thinking about needs of others, and trying to find ways to meet that. Yeah.
And something I've heard you say many times, and I totally agree with you, and this is part of some of the work that I know you do in the Foundry and delivery, is you often talk about how much time leaders should be spending on relationships to create alignment. That's another thing that I think has been sacrificed. I think teams are, they've kind of lost that connectivity and that alignment around a common goal and common vision because they're not investing in the conversations, in the relationships. It's almost like every time we see a screen filled with smiling faces, they're 15 smiling faces, very disjointed and very siloed, and it's kind of the environment that we're in. But you and I both know that if those faces are not talking to each other and continuing to invest personally and professionally, they're going to suffer as a team.
Yeah. I think we're taking on some important topics here that some of this could definitely apply to any team. I want to pivot it just slightly and go down a more focused angle. When you think about the difference between teams, even more senior-ish teams, versus an XLT or an SLT, we think about the most senior team. What are some of those unique challenges that happen in the most senior teams that we need to be aware of and watch out for?
Well, I think every leadership team needs to be cognizant that they are going to be the role models for someone. So I don't care if you're the CIO with your directs, you're modeling for the rest of your organization how to behave. You're setting the tone. But if you're the XLT, if you're at the top of the food chain, the entire company is likely going to watch you and maybe model your behavior. So if you're on an executive team and you're dysfunctional, if your relationships aren't working, if you're not aligned, if you're not practicing candor, if you're not managing your time well, I could just go on and on and on. If you're not doing those things well, what is the ripple effect throughout the organization? Well, that's how they operate. That must be the way we do it.
Yeah.
And I think that's a real issue. So everything that happens there cascades down.
Yeah, I would agree. As I think about that question, one thing I also think makes it really challenging for like an XLT or an SLT is, if you're in an department team, let's say it's a marketing department, you've got a lot of brand managers on that team. You're all basically doing the same thing. So you don't have to talk to each other, but you have a lot of common interests.
Right.
Your common work you're doing. And you can collaborate and sometimes you are put together on projects. But if you're on an XLT, the CFO is not doing the same thing as the CHRO,
right,
or the COO, or the CMO. And I may not even know that world very well, or I may not even care about that world very well. And on top of that, I got plenty in my world that I can dedicate all my time on. So when we think about things like alignment, it makes it that much more challenging because it's not as organic or as natural, because why would I talk to the people in marketing?
Well, see, but that senior executive team, you're right. It's not a bunch of brand managers talking about getting the widget, more market share. You're talking about this executive team is the keeper of the culture. They're the keeper of the values, the keeper of the mission. So if they don't have alignment around those things, just think again about the dysfunction that results.
Yeah, and the analogy that you've heard me say before that makes sense to me, hopefully makes sense to people listening, is companies like a car. And some functions are brake pedal functions, and some functions are gas pedal functions. Marketing and sales are gas pedal functions. And they're like, sell, and spend, right? And those are fun. But if we're only got our foot on the gas pedal, it's a fun ride for about 6 months, and then off the cliff we go.
Yes.
And then there's some functions like the finance organization, sometimes HR, definitely legal, are brake pedal functions, where it's like, hold on, wait a minute, we got to keep ourselves safe. But if you only put your foot on the brake pedal, you don't leave the parking space. So you need both to make that car kind of hug those turns as you're going around the mountain. So alignment, to your point, is really critical. It's not a nice to have. It's a mandatory thing. You've got to have the brake and the gas. But I think it becomes less and less natural the higher up we go. So you're definitely making the important point that it's mandatory, folks. You're setting the culture.
Yes.
It allows the business to function well, but it's easier to fall in your own little world and just talk to the folks that you know and know you.
There's one other issue that you and I haven't talked about, and I'm actually glad that we waited to this point, because I think we needed to get those other things out there.
I'm nervous.
Don't be nervous.
We haven't talked about this yet.
It's all good. So if we are working on that foundation of really solid relationships, and we know that if we do that, we're going to have more candor and more alignment and all the things that matter. The thing that's also going to happen is we're likely to have more trust. And sometimes, especially in the climate we're in today, I think you and I are seeing more and more teams are having trust issues. It bubbles up every time we do gap interviews, every time that we do our investigative work to get ready for a large project. We always find that word bubbles to the surface. So I think those other things we mentioned, all important, but it's also the lack of relationships and the lack of candor. All those things are creating environments where distrust is prominent.
Okay, here's a curveball.
Okay.
Are you ready?
Yes.
It's the chicken or the egg. Is it trust gets us alignment and candor, or candor and alignment gets us trust?
That's a great question. But actually, I'm going to throw you a curveball back. See, I always believe that it starts with strong relationships. See, I think that's the foundational piece. So I think if you've got the relationships right, if you're talking to your colleagues, if you're invested in your colleagues and you know each other, well, what is the natural byproduct of that? We're going to be aligned because we're in sync. We are going to have candor because I know that when you say something difficult to me, that I know that you didn't mean anything bad by it. I know your heart is good. So I think trust is another positive offshoot if you have solid relationships. So I think, at the end of this conversation that you and I just started, 10 minutes ago, I think it comes down to, does the team, executive team, junior leadership team, whatever, do they have solid relationships? And if they do, if that's their foundation, then all those other things can blossom and grow.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. So it's kind of like starting with the relationships first. So in a minute, I want to pivot into people who are listening. What are some practical things they can start to do to improve how their team functions, whether it's your team or you're operating part of the senior team. One more important thing I've observed that I wanted to share with you and your perspective on it. I also see sometimes particularly with those XLTs, those most senior teams, that not always, but sometimes they can do this triangulation effect with the CEO. So rather than try and work it out amongst themselves, they go to mom or dad to try and break that tie, which then causes this issue because the CEO is constantly bickering from siblings all the time. I don't know if that's something that you've seen, but if you have, what are your observations around that, and why is that not necessarily a good thing?
Yeah, I do see that, and I think you could probably find traces of that potentially in their lack of willingness to be candid with each other. So they'll talk to dad or mom rather than to each other. So I definitely feel like sometimes just the fear of being candid with each other causes that. It goes back to something that you have been teaching and preaching forever, and it's a part of the Leadership Foundry work we do, is you talk about author versus editor a lot, and I know you'll probably talk about that later, but they're forcing the CEO to really be the author when they need to be the ones owning their conversation, solving their own problems, fixing things on their own. They'd rather just kind of throw it on the CEO's table and say, well, what do you think we should do, boss? And that's a real challenge because the CEO in an organization needs to be the editor. They need to edit the work of all the people around them. And again, I know you'll probably talk about that later, but that's my take. And I do see it. I do see it a lot.
Yeah, it reminds me, as you were saying that, I was doing work with a retailer a few years ago, and one of the guys had come from another retailer, and he talked about this great team that he was on. He said we were all regional managers or regional directors, and we reported to like the VP of stores, who was in charge of all the stores. And he said what we ended up learning to do was we did this best practice right before we had a call with her. She ran all the stores. We would all come together and have a pre-call. We'd all talk about what was going on, and we'd all get aligned on what we were seeing in our different regions and what we were going to do going forward. So when we got on the call with her, we were all on the same page, and we would all basically share the same thing. We would author something for her, and she loved it because then she can edit, she could react to it. She said when we didn't do that, we'd all be talking different things, and she wouldn't know what to do until she would jump in and start telling us what to do, and we weren't all on the same page. So it kind of goes back to that author editor, and a nice kind of segues to kind of what we can start to do.
Yes.
So any other big glaring warning signs we need to look out for before we pivot into, okay, what do we do with this stuff?
Well, since we're opening up Pandora's box today, it sounds like I've got one more.
Okay.
And it's a big one.
Oh, I'm ready.
And this is actually going to be a future blog post as well, and I can't wait to write it. But it's the lack of clarity, and this is an interesting one because I think so often I see leaders and teams engage in work without really clear understanding of what's the purpose. Why are we doing this? Why are we having this meeting? What's the ownership? Who owns this? What is the exact task you're asking us to complete? When is that due? I have actually been in senior leadership meetings where at the end of the meeting, the call to action was, we need to get sales up this quarter. What does that mean? Who owns that? What is your role in that? And when is it due? No, get sales up. We've got to get sales up. We've got to get our margins up, guys. I don't know what to do with that. And I think most leaders don't. But I am appalled and shocked at how pervasive the lack of clarity is. So I know you and I always try to bring an element of clarity to everything we do. We try to help our clients really get focused on that. But I think that's a big issue.
Yeah. Okay, so why don't we try and spend the remainder of our time doing some little solving for some of these.
Okay.
So if you had a starting place, so let's say someone's listening to this right now and they're thinking of either their team or their senior team as they're observing it, where would you say they should start?
So there are a couple ways to answer that question. I mean, there is certainly work that the team needs to do for themselves. If you are able to engage with someone like the Leadership Foundry and the work that we do, you and I are very fond of a gap interview process where you actually have someone interview each team member and then share anonymously their feedback with the whole team. And that also includes, giving yourselves a score on a scale of 1 to 10. Where are you?
Yeah.
And that is a really effective strategy where in one meeting you're sharing as a baseline, this is where you are. And then start to work on, because one of the questions is probably, what are the areas that this team doesn't do well? You start to identify those areas, and then you build a strategy around identifying and working to fix each of those areas. So that's where you bring in an outside group, like the Foundry or someone else, to do that for you. You can also sit down and really just create some rules if you just want to do this yourselves as a team and build some ground rules. You and I always help our client team sort of develop their ground rules at the beginning of work with us. Well, do that on your own and just agree that we are going to speak openly. We are going to have honest conversations. We will not leave here without clear accountability on who owns what. Just get the sensible ground rules in place. And then start to have some open discussions about what's not working, where do we have brokenness, what's dysfunctional. Now, I think the second option is actually the least likely to happen. I think we both might agree in our experience that you need to have an outside catalyst or someone that can be the honest broker to help get that conversation started. But if a leadership team does want to go down that path, they have to start with exploring what's really going on. See, I think one of the challenges I see in so many client teams is they're afraid to have the difficult conversation. Nobody wants to say their baby's ugly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, and as you were talking about that last one, it made me think, when it's a process, it doesn't feel personal. I don't know if I made that up somewhere just because it sounds good, or if I read it somewhere. I probably read it somewhere because I'm not that smart. I don't think I got to come up with that. Mm-hmm. But I love that idea of if it's a process, it's not personal. Mm-hmm. And it makes me think of like the military where they do their after action reviews.
Yes.
What worked, what didn't, what could we improve going forward. Mm-hmm. So maybe there's a way to make it a process so we're not saying, okay, who screwed up? Joe messed up this quarter. Like we can say, okay, what worked this quarter? Everybody, something we can improve upon? How do we want to adjust or change for next quarter? Mm-hmm. And just do it at the end of every quarter. Mm-hmm. So it's a rhythm and everyone knows it's coming and they can kind of prepare for it. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's good. Well, I think I think that's great. We've got 3 initial good action steps here. We could do gap interviews, which you and I are big fans of because, we do those with our clients and it helps them and just to sort of people to sort of double down on what you said, then we're playing back all the things they told us anonymously. So we're actually practicing candor with them. They're seeing their candid responses.
And it creates your baseline. This is where you are. Like it or not, we're starting here.
And everyone responds so well to that process because it puts it out on the table. There's almost like this like deep sigh of relief, like I've been, oh, you feel that way too? And it's surprising how everyone feels the similar way. Set the ground rules, which is really important, on how you want to operate going forward, and then start those open discussions on what's not working. How about some other tips on how to nurture the relationships? Because I think that's also an important point. You hit that drumbeat a couple times. I want to make sure that we are feeding that. What are some things that people can be doing around that?
I think for anything to really thrive, I'm going to put this squarely on the shoulders of, if it's an executive team, the CEO. I'm going to put it on whoever is at the top of the food chain of this particular team, whatever level you are. And that leader has to model this behavior. They have to not only say it's important, but they have to do it. They need to pick up the phone and start investing time and getting to know their colleagues and being vulnerable. And I've said vulnerability at least 2 or 3 times. It would be really a complete miss if I said, hey, tell me what's going on in your house. Are you okay? And then didn't share. It's almost like I'm prying. But what if I said, hey, Brandon, listen, I don't know how you're doing right now, but I just want to tell you, we've got 3 young kids in our house, and homeschool has been a nightmare, and my wife just lost her job, and we're struggling right now in the age of COVID. How are you doing? I am much more likely to get an honest answer. So to get back to your point, I think it starts with the leader of this particular team. They need to show the vulnerability. They need to reach out and create these relationships, or foster them, or reinvest in them. Everyone will say, oh, I've got relationships with my colleagues on the team. I know those guys. I know them. But that was, maybe you're thinking about the way that it used to exist pre-COVID. What have you been doing since COVID? Have you been making the same level of investments? And in some pockets and cases, we know it does exist. But I think it starts with, how do we get these relationships back on track? And I put it on the shoulders of the executive in charge, just to set the tone and start it, and really encourage it. The other thing you can do is have no business agendas. Hey, listen, we're going to get together today. And I'm very fond of sharing this idea from Keith Ferrazzi. He calls it sweet and sour. I think I've heard it called roses and thorns, where at the beginning of a meeting, you do a lightning round, and the leader who called the meeting starts it. And you basically ask everyone to share one thing in your life that is sweet, or a rose. What is going well in your life right now? Just say one thing. And then right after that, what is your sour? What is your thorn? What's not going well? And if the leader starts with vulnerability and does the lightning round, you're going to learn about what's going on in your colleagues' lives. Now, as a sort of an add-on here, the leader that hears these things needs to be listening intently, because there may be something that comes up they need to probe and look into later. But I think that's another way that we could start to create a real conversation about what's going on in our lives. And that's going to help relationships.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, well, Randy, we've got some good actions here that we can start to take. I like that you narrowed in on the role of the leader of the team. So absolutely, a lot of the stuff can be for senior teams, but a lot of this stuff can be applied to any team. And there's a role, though, that leader of the team plays to set the tone. Yes. Any other action steps, anything else that you think we need to add into our stew today?
I think about some of the work you and I do around helping teams fix dysfunctional business meetings. I think it's a couple things that are very helpful, maybe small add-ons, is find someone to be the Yoda in every meeting, someone that is there to kind of keep the meeting on track, someone who's there to encourage people that have not been speaking up to open up. It's just someone that's going to help the conversation stay on track. And it should not be the leader of the meeting. It should be other people. We should all take turns doing that. So just having someone in the meeting to invite discussion, encourage debate, it's a healthy role to play. The other, I think the other thing that I would say, and this may seem very tactical, is make sure that someone is taking notes in a meeting. When there's accountability discussed, writing down who owns what, and if you don't hear clarity around that accountability, ask for it. And that's just another way to encourage people to be very clear about the action steps, who's going to do it, and when it's due. I think that's just another element here. I know these are very tactical things, but they're things that work, and you and I both see them work.
Yeah. But that also goes to your point earlier around lack of clarity and making sure that someone's
Yes.
taking those notes and you're clearly assigning, or people are taking responsibility for. So then the next meeting, you're building on it.
Yes.
I always use the analogy of, you don't want your meetings to be like Groundhog Day and Bill Murray.
Yes.
And I'm not even using that analogy to describe us living in a pandemic, but either way, good movie for lots of references. Randy, this was absolutely great. So, I always ask you this question every time you come on, although your answer may change today.
Sure.
Do you have one life hack for us on how we can have either better conversations at work or build better relationships at work or at home?
It's funny today, unfortunately, I keep talking about, I just wrote this in a blog post. I'm going to say that again. I just wrote this in a blog post, and the blog post was titled The Ripple Effect of Our Actions. And that post is about something very interesting that I've observed for a very long time, that we need to remember that our actions as professionals do not exist in a vacuum. There's always a ripple effect from every action. So every time that we do an email, make a phone call, get on a Zoom call, make a decision about whatever, there are human beings on the other end of that. Now that seems very obvious, but this is what I've observed, that when we're really, really busy, we are looking at all of our actions as simply things to check off a list. I've got my to-do list, get everything done, and we don't spend enough time reflecting on the person on the other end of our actions. So that's what I mean by the ripple effect. Everything we do affects someone, but when we're really busy, we don't take enough time to think about that. So my encouragement to your listeners is to pause and reflect a little bit. Think about everything that you do, and remember, there's someone on the other end of it, and you might want to put yourself in their shoes and look at the world through their eyes before you make the call, make the decision, or send the email. So I think it's just good advice in general. Slow down and think about what you're doing and who's affected by it.
I think it's really important. Important because you're right. When we're moving fast, we're not thinking that way. And sometimes those emails that, in an effort to be speedy,
Yes.
can come across as blunt or maybe even taken the wrong way.
Yes.
And then now we have to clean that up.
Yes.
And we've created two problems instead of solving for one. Okay, so the last thing before I let you go. Normally we talk about, the different kind of work that we do, and you and I both have had practices over our careers. But the project we've been working on together has been the Leadership Foundry. That's been something you and I have been working on for well over 3 years now, but has really transformed over the last year as we've been serving clients and all their leaders virtually. So, the Leadership Foundry, of course, sponsors the show. You and I are co-founders of the Leadership Foundry. And the website is My Leadership Foundry. We would have gotten the Leadership Foundry, but it was already taken. We got My Leadership Foundry, which I like just as much.
It's even better. Yeah.
It's even better.
Yes.
So in your own words, how would you describe the Leadership Foundry to folks that are listening today?
I think I remember 3.5, 4 years ago when you and I really started thinking about this concept. We had this passion and mission in our minds that we wanted to offer high quality leadership development that was extremely interactive and effective and action oriented to that middle layer of leadership, sort of that manager to vice president level. Because we both have observed that there's always a pretty heavy investment in leaders above that level, and then there's a lot of training that's available that's more, sort of the standard stuff, but there wasn't high quality leadership development being offered. And you and I knew that with our backgrounds and experiences and the work we did, we could create something that was very special and effective. And I think that was really the impetus behind getting Leadership Foundry out to the market. And when COVID hit, we had already made the decision that we were going to make everything we do virtual. So we have come up with highly interactive approaches in a virtual offering. We use Zoom, that's our preferred tool. And it's making a difference in our clients. We can see it, it's measurable. We know that we're doing the work that needs to be done, and we're just excited to see the growth of this thing. I think the other thing that's been exciting is we're also bringing something equally effective to senior leadership teams. Increasingly, we're being asked to work with the executive teams of our client companies. So I think that when we pooled our resources and had a very clear mission to offer high quality, highly interactive leadership development, we have stayed true to that the whole time, and I'm very proud of that.
Yeah.
And it's working.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to spoil our kind of secret recipe,
Sure.
but we do put in some high quality programming and content
Yes.
that is customized for clients. There are firms that do that kind of work, but we do that, and we think we do it in a very unique way.
Yes.
But we also combine it with coaching, one-on-one coaching, to make it a very personalized experience. The analogy I always use is, you wouldn't walk out of Nordstrom's with a dress or a suit without hitting the tailor on the way out. The tailor really makes it fit.
Yes.
Most programs that are in the leadership development space don't do that. And then combine that with our proprietary app that we've created and action learning projects. We've got a recipe that we found to be very successful. So, and it's fun because we get to scale what we would normally do one-on-one and be able to serve larger groups.
Yes.
So, several folks have asked me kind of what does the Leadership Foundry do, and I thought it'd be helpful for you and I to kind of share a little bit about that as we ended our time here today. So, hey, Randy, my friend, this was great, as it always is. And naturally, I'm sure I'll have to have you back again. You definitely have the most visits on this show. I don't know what that number is, but it's a lot. So
74.
Something like that.
Yeah. Always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you know, I've had Randy on my show. I can't tell you how many times, and every time he comes on, I'm always taking notes. And this time is no different. I got my list of notes. So these are some things that really stood out from what I heard Randy say. So when I asked Randy the question of what are some issues, what are some things you see in teams? Now remember, as I go through these, think about your own team, whether you're on a senior team or just a regular team, because many of these translate. He said lack of candor is one of the big issues. People just aren't open and honest. Our relationships are deteriorating. We're not investing in those the way we should be or could be. We're not creating space, time to think about others, just think about what we want to be doing. And we're not creating time and space for alignment. We're not trying to focus on aligning with others like we should. And then we went a little bit further and said, how about particularly XLTs, like the most senior of all the teams, the people with all the C-level titles? And Randy said, well, gosh, these folks have to be modeling it for the rest of the organization. So that's a different set of lenses you have to look through. Like, people are watching you. You kind of your mom or dad, and they're going to be watching you and kind of modeling their behavior. Triangulation with the CEO, we talked a little about that. We also talked about how, and I mentioned this point, where it's not natural for these functions to talk to each other. Marketing doesn't naturally want to go hang out and talk with finance, but they really need to. So it's not as common or as natural. And then Randy mentioned lack of clarity. So then that gets us to our last important list. I said, all right, Randy, what are some things we need to be doing? And this is what he hit us with. He said, first, start with a gap interview. Either you do it or you get someone else to do it externally, but get interviews done with everyone on the team so you get an honest list of what are the real issues. Set some ground rules of how you want to operate going forward as a team. He mentioned that. Really, really healthy and helpful, and kind of remind the team every time they get together, these are our ground rules that we committed to. Open discussion on what's not working and starting to foster that. We talked a little about leveraging what a prior guest, Ken Keene, retired Lieutenant General Ken Keene, mentioned about after-action reviews in the military for that one. Nurturing the relationships, and really it has to be modeled, and model that from the CEO. And then Randy mentioned the whole, in meetings, use the sweet and sour technique from Keith Ferrazzi. Assign someone to be the Yoda to make sure that the conversations are being open and honest. And then finally, kind of make sure that at the end of every meeting, we're outlining next steps. We've got someone who's taking good notes, so we know who to be held accountable and who's going to do what. So a great list of stuff that we can look at for our own teams and ways to make our teams even better. Because after all, if we've got really, really healthy teams we're working with, not only is it more fun, we get a lot more stuff done.
Thanks for listening to the Workplace Therapist Show. We love to share reviews, and we're going to share another one today. This one comes from Topical Todd, who left us 5 stars and says, very beneficial. For those struggling in their career and at a crossroads, this is the podcast for you. Brandon has great content every episode and awesome guests to help with those topics that some of us are struggling with. I love hearing that. I love that our show is practical and easy to use. So for the rest of you who find it that way, please rate and review us on iTunes or wherever you're listening to your podcast.